Salutare, salutare la toată lumea! Bine v-am regăsit la Garantat 100%. Invitatul nostru din seara asta s-a născut în 1952. E unul dintre cei mai cunoscuți jurnaliști din lume, analist de politică externă și expert în istoria războiului rece. Cel puțin două dintre cărțile sale au făcut valuri în România, Fantomele Balcanilor și La răsărit spre Tartaria. Printre altele, invitatul nostru este un profund cunoscător al României, al spațiului balcanic, est-european și al Orientului Mijlociu. Cărțile și articolele sale se bucură de apreciere în întreaga lume. A fost profesor invitat la Academia Navală a Statelor Unite, membru al Departamentului Apărării și a consiliat președinții americani, secretari de stat, miniștrii ai apărării. Domnia sa se află acum în România pentru lansarea celui mai recent volum, În umbra Europei, 2 războaie reci și 3 decenii de călătorie prin România și dincolo de ea, volum apărut la editura Humanitas. Doamnelor și domnilor, suntem onorați să-i spunem bun venit la Garantat 100% domnului Robert D. Kaplan. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a privilege to have you as a guest in our show.
Thank you.
Sir, how would you professionally identify yourself? I mean, a political analyst, a theorist, a foreign policy expert, a writer, a journalist.
I am a journalist who grew out of journalism, who evolved out of journalism, who wasn't satisfied covering hard news, covering press conferences. I felt that there was something deeper, both historical and philosophical, that a foreign correspondent, before he goes to a country, should read many books about the country's history, because history didn't begin the day that correspondent arrived. Also should read many books about political philosophy. How could you understand chaotic countries in the former Third World if you have not read Thomas Hobbes, if you have not read Samuel Huntington's Political Order and Changing Societies? So it wasn't that I evolved beyond journalism, is the way to put it. And especially now, as conventional journalism in the United States is descending in quality because of the digital age, many, not only me, many serious journalists find themselves writing books, working for think tanks, doing the things that I'm doing in order to stay serious while still making a living.
Some of the contemporary journalists will ask you, when will I have enough time to do my job if I read books?
And I would answer that you cannot do your job if you cannot read books. I fully agree. If all you do is tweet and answer emails.
I fully agree. In Europe's Shadow, you talk a lot about the position and attitude that a journalist, especially a press correspondent, should have towards the events he witnesses. And you talk about the very subtle difference between empathy and sympathy.
That's correct. Empathy is when you put yourself in somebody else's shoes and try to see the world through their eyes. How do you analyze Vladimir Putin? Through empathy. You use empathetic analysis. What is his worldview? His worldview is that Russia was not only invaded by Hitler and Stalin, but by Swedes, Lithuanians, and Poles. It has no border in protecting it from the North European plain, so it requires a zone of soft imperial-like influence throughout Central Eastern Europe. Sympathy is when you actually agree with the person's point of view.
Right.
That's very different. That's almost 180 degrees opposite. But empathy is necessary, because or else all you're doing is projecting your own values and your own life experience and your own cultural experience onto others. And that does not lead to an understanding of the world.
How did you manage with sympathy and empathy when you talk about Romania? Because, I don't know, you had to get familiar with things happening here. And there's a whole game in between empathy and sympathy.
Yes. What I learned is that the more you read, and again, not just history, but philosophy, geopolitics, the more you can see the world from the Romanian point of view. And to me, Romania is particularly fascinating because the northwest of the country, beyond the Carpathians, is Central Europe. It's former Habsburg Central Europe. And southeastern part of the country, inside the Carpathians, is former Byzantine, former Ottoman, and that's Eastern Europe, or even the beginning of the Near East in history. So Romania straddles two worlds. It's also part Greek because of the Orthodox Church, which was originally Greek, and it's Latin. So because of the language. So it combines Rome and ancient Greece together with Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And it's a Black Sea country. It really, to me, it's got everything. It's a laboratory from with which I can explore big issues like the Holocaust, the Cold War, the legacy of empires, the challenge of Vladimir Putin, maybe one country, but what I wanted to do in this book was a deep vertical dive rather than a broad horizontal spread of 6 or 7 countries.
Sir, one of the profound needs and imperatives that you identify in Romanians is what you call the need to escape from history. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is Romania has had a particularly difficult geographical position. During World War I, it was occupied. It suffered semi-famine conditions. During World War II, it was caught between Hitler and Stalin when the United States was in an isolationist mode, really up until Pearl Harbor. And the United States military in full force did not arrive in the heart of Europe until 1944.
We'll get to that.
Yeah. But Romania has always been too close to Russia and too far from the West, or the power centers of the West. And that has led to all kinds of historical tragedies. It's only, I would argue, in the last 25 years that Romanian history has been, from my point of view, despite all the complaints people have here, has been very normalized and very secure and stable.
Are you comfortable when you talk to Romanians and when they complain?
What I try to do is, everyone complains. But what are they complaining about? They're complaining about corruption and inefficiency, which are good things to complain about. It's better that they do that than they're supporting extreme right-wing movements or extreme left-wing movements or anarchist movements or so. In other words, their complaints are healthy, modernizing complaints. A public mood that's obsessed with corruption and better government is a country that's going to do well in the future.
What will you answer when they complain about the fatalism of their historical destiny, for example?
I would say that history is a combination of vast impersonal forces that's hard to change, and contingency, human choice. And there's a lot in the human choice that can change history. In other words, look at Singapore. Tiny country surrounded by bigger enemy countries in the early 1960s. What did Singapore do? It created the most cleanest, efficient government in the world and attracted massive foreign investment, and thereby providing security. There's no reason why Romania can't do the same.
You also talk in your book about a sort of Ronald Reagan model, a rather non-interventional military point of view. And you say, people under the power of dictatorship have to free themselves. This is also part of your answer when some of my compatriots will ask you about why didn't the Americans come earlier, for example. Let's talk about this non-interventional point of view.
The United States cannot save every country. What the United States, like any great power, does is it protects its own interests, and part of its interests are providing for a world environment that's safe for the American people. And because the United States is a liberal democracy, the United States tries to project, to expand the boundaries of civil society around the world. Usually that's meaning more democracies, but in the Middle East it means supporting enlightened dictators, like in Morocco or Jordan or Oman, It's better them than chaos, in other words. But the United States cannot use military force to liberate every country. All it can do is push history forward in a regional sense. But what I learned, through my own mistakes, is that people have to liberate themselves. Except, of course, there will be extreme instances where a regime may constitute a specific and definable threat to the United States that needs to be dealt with. That happens rarely.
On the other hand, you strongly supported direct American military intervention in Yugoslavia.
Yes.
And you did the same in the case of the Kosovo War.
Yeah, I supported intervention because I felt that we weren't so much invading a country as trying to stop a war. And I felt the objectives were limited. They were limited objectives. And also we went in with a coalition, it was NATO.
Yep.
I felt that if NATO could not deal with a crisis close to the heart of Europe so soon after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, people would doubt whether NATO could further exist. Also, I took a geopolitical point of view, which was I supported the extension of NATO to the Black Sea early in the 1990s. Because I knew that the United States would need bases because I saw the Middle East unraveling. And so I knew that if the United States did not stop the chaos in the former Yugoslavia, it would make it impossible to expand NATO to the Black Sea. Because it would open the door for renewed Russian influence in the region.
You also said that the fear of Russia. You identify among Romanians you met along your journeys a long historical fear of Russia. Let's put some nuances inside this.
All right. Well, first of all, I argue in a very subtle way. For instance, in my chapter about Yash, I talk about how in the 19th century, Russia, because it was they were fellow Orthodox Christians, actually offered protection to Romania in some ways against the Ottoman Empire at the time. So Romania's history with Russia is not completely stark and hostile. The Orthodox churches helped each other for a long period. Russia was not seen as the absolute 100% enemy for significant times in the 19th century. But when you look at the number of times that Russia invaded or went through Romanian territory, like in the 19th century, the Crimean War, Romania was, blocked Russia from getting to the Mediterranean and further south along the Black Sea. So that, Romania probably has the worst experience with Russia in the early modern and modern period, except for arguably Poland, which disappeared in the 19th century and was dismembered by Russia.
Sir, how will you react when you meet some of my fellow compatriots that will have enough courage as to tell you, Mr. Kaplan, I do respect your work. I think you're a wonderful journalist, that your level of documentation is very high. You know lots of details about Romania, but you don't have a clue about real Romanians. How do you answer to that?
What I say is when an outsider looks at anything...
You've met positions like this.
Yes, yeah. This is what a journalist does. I mean, and here, when an outsider looks at a professional subculture, looks at a corporation as an investigative journalist, looks at a country as an outsider, there are a lot of little things he'll miss, that he'll get wrong, but he will also see big things that the locals don't see because they're too involved in it. They don't have that outside perspective. In fact, I quote someone, this is talking about journalism in the early part of the book, saying never trust the opinion of a profession from those who practice it.
Right.
You can only see just how healthy that profession is from only an outsider can see that. So sure, there are things I'll miss, things I'll get wrong, but it's what I'm trying to do is show an outsider's point, an outsider who studies the country and looking at it from a distance, from 20,000 feet rather than from 5,000 feet.
Have you met the position of the type, Mr. Kaplan, help, please help us?
Yes, I have. And what I say is that it's very hard for Romania to get attention in Washington because Romania offers no cataclysm, no crisis. It's not collapsing. It's not at war. Official Washington, the media is just obsessed with catastrophes. Whether it's Syria, whether it's North Korea, whatever. Romania happily doesn't offer a catastrophe. But what's real important is that you're not really looking for the attention of Washington or of America. You're looking for the attention of like 500 people inside Washington who are the experts, who have the specific jobs at the State Department, the Department of Defense, the CIA, the various think tanks around town, the National Security Council staff. It's about 500 or 600, 700 people. That's what you're dealing with. And those people you can get the attention of. And those people will often surprise you with their knowledge. And their frustration is that they cannot get the attention of their bosses. That's the real issue. Not that you can't get their attention, they cannot get the attention of their bosses.
Some of the Romanians will tell you that there's a national obsession, and you obviously know that. There's a national obsession that says Romania doesn't matter. How would you answer to that?
Well, I would answer in two ways. First of all, it matters more and more. And this 600 or 700 people are noticing it. I mean, the F-22s that flew here for one day didn't come out of the blue, to mix a metaphor. They did come out of the blue. But that was a deliberate attempt by the Department of Defense to send the most lethal, sensitive weapon in America's fighter jet arsenal to Romania in order to protest what the Russians had done in the Baltic Sea, with their planes buzzing destroyers. So Romania is on the radar screen. But a country only matters when it's in a serious crisis. I mean, Washington has no attention span. It goes from crisis to crisis, and that's all it deals with.
Your perspective within this book is a very profound one. A universe of details. But at a certain moment, you say that this historical moment for Romania is the best that we could have.
Yes.
How's that?
Absolutely. Because there is no perfection. There is no heaven. All there is managing fairly well with daily crises. And the crises that exist in this country now, corrupt politicians, people may be disappointed a bit with the president, corruption commission, all of that. Those are normal. Those are not, in the larger scheme of things, they're not existential crises. Look at the 20th century for Romania. Occupation, semi-starvation, World War I, political chaos and extremism in the interwar period, royal dictatorship, a Nazi-allied regime, military dictatorship during World War II, then the worst extreme form of Stalinism in the entire Warsaw Pact from the late 40s to 1989. It was such a nightmare that I would say World War II did not end for Romania until 1989. It was the long European War from 1914 to 1989. Now, compared with that, What's happened since 1989? Romania has not had ethnic warfare like Yugoslavia.
Fortunately.
Yeah, it has not fallen into momentary chaos like Bulgaria or Albania. It has not had an economic collapse like Greece. Romania is lucky it did not get into the Eurozone, or else it risked being like Greece. It's lucky it didn't get into Schengen at this moment, or else it would have many more refugees from the Muslim world. All things being, and by the way, last year Romania posted the second highest economic growth rate in Europe, 3.8%. And the economy had been growing at a reasonable level for quite a few years. That to me is as good as you get.
On the other hand, someone could tell you, Mr. Kaplan, don't you see it as a huge menace if the state is confiscated by corruption?
It is a huge menace, but also it's recognized. And there's an anti-corruption commission, and the public is motivated. So I think these are good signs in general. I think there's reason to be optimistic. And as you know, I'm not generally an optimist. If you look at all my books.
You're right.
And I think you could be reasonably, guardedly optimistic that over the years, government will gradually perform at a higher standard here. The very fact that you have a government of middle-of-the-road technocrats is a good sign.
I know very precise, very specific readers of your books, and some of them will say something like this. Kaplan is good. He knows lots of things. He tried to get the inner fiber of the Romanians. But he talks about us in cultural terms, not as about a major culture as we are. He doesn't understand the fact that we are a major culture. How would you answer to that?
Romania is a very unique culture. It's a culture of 23 million people. But what's a major culture? I mean, China with 1.4 billion people, India with 1.1 billion people, Iran or Turkey with 80 million people, which is still 3-4 times the size of Romania. And so in quantitative terms, Romania is not, is not a pivotal world impact culture like those are. So remember, I cover the world, so you have to categorize things.
There's a quotation from yourself that could give some of us goosebumps. I quote, "I really am afraid that Moldova will become soon a hot topic for the news." End of quotation from this book.
Yeah, I wrote, the words I used in English was, I was afraid Moldova has a future in the news.
Okay.
That it has a future in the news.
So we'll make it softer.
Yeah,
okay.
And I got that phrase from a very talented American diplomat in 1984, Dan Freed, and who told me, concentrate on Yugoslavia. It'll be good for your career. This place has a future in the news, at a time that it was totally not in the news at all. And yes, because Moldova is, it doesn't have an identity as a state. And it was not independent till 1991. It was back and forth between Russia or Tsarist Russia or the Soviet Union and Romania. It has large ethnic minorities, the Gagauz, Turks, the ethnic Russians, ethnic Ukrainians, who don't feel loyal to the state, who feel the state is dominated too much by ethnic Romanians. So it's a very weak form of identity. It never became a member of the EU or NATO like Romania. It was part of the Soviet Union, not just the Warsaw Pact like Romania. So it's the levels of corruption, of cynicism, of inefficiency, the level of democracy is at a far, far lower level than in Romania. And a place like that is dangerous, especially since Putin cannot allow for a strong, stable Moldova that's united with the West. meaning united with the European Union or with NATO, like Romania is. So whenever Moldova tends to stabilize, if it does, the Russians will have a self-interest in destabilizing it. So that's why I said that. I wrote that.
Sir, you've been an important advisor of officials and presidents in the United States. Are you ever sorry for any of the advices that you offered?
Well, I haven't been an important advisor. That's in Washington.
Okay.
In Washington terms, I have not been.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, at a Washington level, I'm a minor player. You know, I did sit on the Defense Policy Board, which meets a few times a year, and offers advice to the Secretary of Defense. That was the only time I was in government or had any official links with government. Yes, I'm not sorry for the advice I gave on the Balkans, because despite how President Clinton, I would say, misused Balkan Ghost or misread it, I was in favor of intervention from the very earliest. The one thing I'm sorry about is I supported in print and in meetings the invasion of Iraq. And I did so because I failed my own test. I saw Iraq, I had been to Saddam's Iraq in the 80s, and Saddam's Iraq was so repressive, so much more so than any other country in the Arab world, including Hafez al-Assad's Syria, that I compared it to Ceausescu's Romania in the 1980s. And I said, this, you know, what can be worse than this? And I was not sufficiently realistic. I should have known, yes, it could be worse than that. You could have chaos. You know, chaos is worse than tyranny, is what I learned from that.
In this book, you also use quoting from Hannah Arendt, and she says, racism could really lead to the apocalypse of the Western world. Can you put some nuances inside this?
Yes, I think what she meant was that the spirit of the West is inherently liberal. I mean liberal in the classic sense of the word, not in the liberal conservative sense of the word, the way they mean it in the United States. You know, it's always towards more inclusion, secularism, democracy, protection of minority rights. That's what the West ultimately means. And racism undermines the West. So I think, and if you undermine the West, you're undermining humanity, because humanity's future lies with a successful West.
You're sure of that?
I don't see any other option at the moment. The United States, with all of its problems and all of its mistakes, still, I think, as a great power, makes for a better world than a Chinese-led world or a Russian-led world. I mean, what other options are there?
Just try to put myself in the shoes of a viewer who sees us, I don't know, from Korea, which is impossible, from North Korea, from China, from the Arab world, for example. Somebody could say, United States is not the whole world.
Well, it's not. It's only 5% of the world population. But it has the influence it does, because despite all its problems, and we read about them every day in this current election cycle, the United States system functions much, much better than that of Europe, the EU, that of China, that of Russia, that of the Arab world. I would much rather have America's problems than their problems.
Sir, I'm very sorry, but one of your maybe not intended prophecies worked, unfortunately. There's a title from one of your articles, written in 1994 in The Atlantic, and the title is like this: The Coming Anarchy, How Scarcity, Crime, Overpopulation, Tribalism, and Disease are rapidly destroying the social fabric of our planet.
Yes.
I'm afraid you were right.
Yeah. I think what people missed at the time was they mistaked this nirvana of the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, and said to themselves, well, look, if countries like Poland and Romania and Czechoslovakia could turn into democracies, well, then Africa can, the Middle East can. They're all going to be democracies. Well, no, they're not, because Central Eastern Europe had a bourgeoisie tradition. Czechoslovakia had a higher rate of industrial production before World War II than even Belgium had.
Right.
Yes, there were vast differences between Poland and Romania, Bulgaria, but they all had a certain Europeanness, which involved a certain bourgeoisie tradition, a certain link to the West. They were geographically adjacent to the European Union, which meant that they could eventually get in, and the European Union could credibly say, you do this, this, and this, and you'll join us.
Yep.
And you believed them because you were right next door. You knew that it was possible. But nobody could make such promises to Africa, to the Middle East, to Central Asia, etc. And those places between the regime at the top and the tribe and family at the bottom had no intermediary levels of civil society. So that when the regime unraveled, there was just utter dust and chaos in their wake. That was not true of the communist states in Central Eastern Europe. Below the level of the regime, there were levels of civil society that in itself stemmed from the bourgeoisie tradition. Now, it was much weaker in Romania and Bulgaria, which had a tradition of Ottoman rule, Byzantine rule. There was more of a peasantry in this part of the world. And that's why Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia had a much harder time after 1989 than, say, Poland or East Germany or Czechoslovakia. But still, you were in a far, far stronger socio-political condition than most of the Middle East or most of sub-Saharan Africa.
I keep on thinking of some virtual viewers who could say something like this. This book is very good. It talks about lots of cultural details. Some of them are really topics put into order, and we miss that. We miss that a lot. But one of our virtual viewers could tell you, this is very good in terms of culture. The world works in terms of economics. What will you tell him?
I would push back at that. I would say the obsession with economics, with policy, is the product of urban elites with advanced degrees who no longer live in the countryside, have no ties to geography, live in an abstract, theoretical world of ideas, and would say there's nothing wrong with Libya that a change in interest rates couldn't solve, essentially. And I'm saying culture still matters. Landscape and geography still matters. That's how normal people think. The people writing that it doesn't matter anymore are not normal. They're the upper crust of the global elite who, someone who's got an Indian father, a Portuguese mother, who speaks 5 languages, went to the London School of Economics. Someone like that is divorced from the layer of society that is 90% of society. They inhabit an upper stratum where they have less in common with their own original cultures than they have with their colleagues from other countries.
Sir, just for the moment, enough with the Romanian problems. Did you decide who will you vote for at the presidential elections in the States?
All right. I'm a moderate conservative. That's who I am. I think in very traditional conservative terms. My heroes are Edmund Burke, Edmund Gibbon, people like that. And so normally, in a normal election with a normal candidate, the Republicans can count on my vote. All right. We have 2 presumptive candidates, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton. I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton, a Democrat, because Donald Trump is not a conservative. He's not even literate, I would say. He lives in a post-literate, he's made an end run around literacy. He lives in a television world. He has no sense of tradition. He's not a role model for young people. He's vulgar. He's extremely vulgar. To me, he's a product of what I call digital barbarianism. The world of the comment streams below articles that are full of vulgar language and insults. The world of Twitter, where everything is summarized in one sentence in a stupid, superficial way. You can only imagine Trump in that universe, so to speak. So, he's a classic demagogue, cult of personality figure. So I cannot vote for him. I'll vote for Hillary Clinton.
What if he won?
If he won, we would be in a frightening new territory, because he has no historical legacy feelings to NATO or World War II or the Cold War. These things mean nothing to him. He says, "Oh, I'm a deal maker. I'll negotiate." But the Obama administration right now is negotiating with Russia over Ukraine. Everyone makes deals all the time. That's nothing new. But if that's all you do, if that's all you can say, it means you have no inner convictions about anything. It means a deal maker has a bottom line.
Yep.
He has no bottom line. And, Obama's a deal maker, but when you ask him, what do you stand for? He doesn't say I'm a deal maker. He says, I support Europe, I support NATO, and I'm trying, but I want to get along with Russia without a war. That's what he would say. That's not what Donald Trump says.
I keep on talking to Romanians living in the States. Some of them would say Trump is good. He knows what he's talking about. The whole establishment has to leave. The whole establishment of the world has to leave, and this is the man who will do it. End of quotation.
Look, that way leads to chaos, because all societies, even democratic ones, depend on elites, on well-educated elites who have experience in policy making. Let me say something. Being a geopolitical analyst is easier than policy making. Policy making is hard. Because all right, a geopolitical analyst says we have to take a stronger line on Ukraine, we have to supply the Ukrainian forces with weapons. A policymaker says, what weapons? If we give them this, it's sensitive, it could fall into Russian hands. If we give them that, how long will it take to train them, and can they use them? And what if it doesn't work? What are the consequences? What's the next move? That's how a policymaker thinks. He thinks 5 chess moves ahead on every single issue. It takes discipline. And you need people in charge of domestic policy, foreign policy, who are very trained, experienced, and disciplined. And without that, you have chaos.
Sir, I come back to your book with a very personal question, I will say. How can you explain to the world that a cultural perspective upon things is still healthy and valid and necessary?
Because without culture, we're nothing. Yes, we're individuals. Yes, we're each different from each other. We have needs, dreams, worries, anxieties. But at the same time, all the people around us speak the same language. We have the same history. What is culture? It's a mentality, or a bonding, a feeling of human need and bondage, based on a similar experience in the same geography, going back hundreds, or in some cases even thousands of years.
Everybody seems to get ready for a war. Do you share this point of view? I mean, I kindly ask you in terms of perception, not in terms of prophecy.
In terms of a war?
Yep.
In this region of the world?
Yep.
Okay. Look, if we go back 20 years, Romania escaped history. It was going to get into NATO, get into the EU. NATO was healthy then. What could be better than the EU? The EU has no problems. It's just getting bigger and richer and stronger. And Russia was conveniently chaotic. under Boris Yeltsin's rule. So Russia was actually not a threat in the 1990s. And so Romania said, the past is forgotten, we've escaped history, we're living in, the end of history it happened back there. Well, now it's different. NATO is, it's questionable about its future. The EU is really in sustained crisis, systemic crisis with fundamental structural problems, and Russia's no longer benign. It's led by someone with an aggressive geopolitical vision of expansion. So the risks are much greater than 20 years ago. And we see it's a very tense military situation with Russian planes playing games with U.S. ships, with the U.S. dispatching F-22s, or, this every day there's something, even if it doesn't make it into the news. Still, I would say that while the consequences would be very bad and high if an incident were to spiral into a conflict, the probability of it happening is still low. Because with Russia's economy going downhill and the need of Putin to get the sanctions lifted, I don't see it in Putin's interest to spark a military conflict. I see him continuing with his policy of subversion.
When you hear something about Romania, you're in the States or you're traveling in the world, and you hear something about Romania, are you empathic or sympathetic?
I tend to get sympathetic then, because people say, where's Romania? No, they do. Oh, isn't that where Dracula's from?
Right.
And I have to say, Dracula didn't exist. It was the product of Bram Stoker's mind. So it tends. Oh, Romania, yeah, that's in Europe. That's that's the kind of thing. Or what's going on in Romania? So you tend to get sympathetic.
One more question, sir. Lots of us would consider today that a journalist is somebody more or less trained supporting a certain side. That could be a definition of the modern journalist. When you talk about a journalist reading books, documenting himself or herself, and writing about something, writing a book, sticking to the same topic for years and years, that is not modern journalism.
The digital age has undermined journalism to such an extent that the word journalism may not be used in 20 or 30 years. It'll become extinct. It's like thought of as part of the print and typewriter age. Journalists are increasingly advocates. Journalists tweet. They take their points of view. Everyone wants to be an opinion writer. Right. Nobody wants to report, because reporting costs money. It really does, because it takes time, it costs money. And nobody has money in the digital age, because digital platforms don't gain the advertising revenues that old print platforms gained. So look at the United States. So many formerly great newspapers, the Baltimore Sun, the Boston Globe, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, closed all their foreign bureaus. The Washington Post has shrunk its foreign bureaus. And New York Times foreign correspondency, though it's still very, very good, I would argue is not quite what it used to be.
Sir, thank you so much for accepting this invitation, and lots of luck with what you do.
Thank you so much.
Privilege to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Recomand cu toată căldurea Robert D. Kaplan în umbra Europei, 2 războaie reci și 3 decenii de călătorie prin România și dincolo de ea. O analiză și o perspectivă deopotrivă profunde despre noi, despre România, despre partea asta de lume. E o carte pe care nu poți să o părăsești, o carte care se citește dintr-o răsuflare, deși nu e deloc o carte ușoară. Tuturor celor care sunt alături de noi, mulțumim pentru încredere, ne vedem data viitoare, noapte bună!